Someone's saying in the chat. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, okay, you're seeing it. All right, David, you're on. Take it away. Oh, let me introduce David, first of all, more formally. I apologize. David's a friend of mine, and like I said, he's an entrepreneur. Got his bio here. A technologist, a polymath, an inventor, and the CEO of Lumena Energy, which is an energy-as-a-service software platform. So he would fall in the software category on the venture capital side. He's a nationally recognized industry leader in renewable energy and a pioneer in virtual power plant technology. He received the Google Innovation Award in 2019. In 2022, he was elected to the board of directors for Arcolith, the world's largest black-owned EV manufacturer. He currently serves on the STEM Council for the University of Chicago as well as the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. He received his MBA from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He has more than 20 years as a technologist. David, take it away.
Thank you. I don't look very old, but I'm not young. Thanks, Mark, for the introduction. So I've come today to talk a little bit about the nuances of virtual power plant architecture. The first thing I'll do is just kind of go into a little more of my own self-bloviation, so we can change the slide. You can probably press the right arrow as well. There we go. So that not so flattering picture of myself. So I am a technologist, software engineer, clean tech subject matter expert. I do these kinds of engagements quite a bit. I am a global member of the Agility electric vehicle company, CEO of Lumena Energy, and I'm a former senior manager at Illinois Solar for All, which is actually how my friend Mark and I met. So Lumena Energy is an energy, not yet, is an energy as a service virtual power plant software platform. So we currently manage just under 4 gigawatts in North America as well as in the Caribbean. I also am the CEO of Lumena Energy Academy, which is a federally funded renewable energy workforce development program, because we realized in creating smart cities and virtual power plants, there's no one qualified to operate them, so we have to train them. Okay, we can go on. Now that I got that out of the way, let's get to the fun stuff. So in this lecture, we'll be talking about what a virtual power plant is, how it operates, why now, benefits, exciting progress. We'll be verging on electrical engineering, IoT, machine learning, UI, UX interface, SCADA system design, a little bit of algebra and calculus, and the blockchain. And there will be minimal self-promotion, so we're okay with that. So I worked very hard on trying to come up with a succinct definition of what a virtual power plant is. And it's basically a bottom-up diversified energy resource network. So essentially what that boils down to is a system that does not rely on big oil to fulfill the energy generation, supply, and delivery. Instead, it focuses on democratization. So instead of that, now you have the small guy. Anyone who owns a piece of property can effectively become an energy generator and a node participant or partner. Does that make sense? Okay, it's working so far. So distributed energy resource networks work basically by connecting systems through energy management, which is kind of where we found our niche in a piece of software that we developed called Parsec. It's very important right now, as you all kind of hinted toward earlier, we need to start creating a sustainable energy economy. If we don't do that, if we don't have a diverse energy portfolio that we can pull from when things like war or natural disasters do come about, we're subject to all of those things, and it's not good. So some of the benefits include decentralized energy delivery and storage, which once again goes back to segmentation of energy resources in the sense that now we don't have to sit back and wait for a ComEd or whomever the local energy provider is to fulfill those resources. And even in the instance of, I see many of you are from other countries, blackouts and brownouts happen quite often in different parts of the world, and they're not managed. Many systems are literally held together by duct tape and bubble gum. And that kind of leads to all sorts of calamity. Even one of the reasons why I started this organization, prior to doing this, I was a pilot. So I traveled to Thailand, and in Bangkok, there's an area called Chinatown. There was a kid who was actually doing his homework in front of a 7-Eleven, if you can imagine it. He had a full desk set up and everything, and I walked over to him and I asked, like, why are you doing this? And his parents, they calmly came over and they're like, well, we don't know when we're going to have energy again. And so now we have to just use whatever available light that we have because flashlights aren't going to do the job. So I said, I think with the available technology that we have now, available resources and manpower, that we could probably craft some kind of solution that's slightly better than a 7-Eleven. So also with the benefits that are offered, peak load management is incredibly important. I'm doing a lot of work in South Africa right now, and they're dealing with something called load shedding. Is anyone familiar with load shedding? So load shedding is basically where energy has to be bled off because there's too much of a demand and the system simply cannot handle it, basically creating blackouts. Also, dynamic control heuristics is incredibly important. Many of the systems that we enjoy in America, we don't feel around the rest of the world, meaning that they have archaic systems that are from the 40s and 50s that are still in operation. So it's important to have systems that can either teach themselves or we can upgrade them so they become more intuitive. Making sense so far? Good? Okay. Enhanced grid resiliency and efficiency. Mark actually just spoke about efficiency. These tenets are incredibly important as it relates to the grid system as a whole, because just to take Chicago, for example, right? We have a fantastic grid in Chicago, but if you were to drive about 25 minutes south to an area called Harvey, Illinois, they have constant rolling blackouts. Olympia Fields has constant rolling blackouts, and that's just part of Illinois. That's just like on the cusp of the largest city in Illinois. Let's forget about the rest of the state or the entire country. So also, it supports EV charging networks. And I'm sure you guys have probably discussed or seen the huge boom that has occurred with electric vehicle production. But what happens when you do have the mandate of 30 million new vehicles on the road? We can't keep up with that. So it's like you're setting the entire world up for failure by trying to make these greenwashed narratives come to life. But in making a virtual power plant a thing, that gets us to this place where now we're ready by 2030 to actually support 30 million vehicles on the road. So we'll be talking about exciting progress in regulatory market integration, policy support, global recognition, ERCOT pilot program, which I'll talk about a little bit later, energy blockchain, which I'm particularly jazzed about, residential technology adoption, market growth, expansion, and scalability. Okay, Mark. Thank you. So let's talk about the types of virtual power plants that currently exist. You have residential, you have commercial, you have storage-based, which is basically solid state form, which is it's batteries. We have renewable energy, which solely relies on a single form of renewable energy, so solar, geothermal, tidal, you name it. Mixed asset, which is what I work in, which is basically all forms of energy production and storage combined. Electric vehicle, which we slightly discussed. Thermal energy, which can sometimes boil down to coal and other forms of types of fossil fuels that burn. And then lastly, GEB, or grid interactive efficient buildings. So smart buildings. I believe, Martin, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a microgrid on this campus, right? So many of the buildings that that we've walked past are actually part of the GEB initiative, believe it or not. We can go to the next slide. So let's talk about ICT, so information communication tech. In order for all of this to actually manifest, it's not just as simple as creating energy and storing it. You actually have to be able to manage the pipeline of data, information gathering, storing, production, so forth. So with that comes hardware, software, network resources, data storage and management, security systems, and co-location facilities. My company, we currently own about 20 machines that are based in a co-location server room, and that's how we are able to manage all of our resources and data feed. Making sense so far? Good. Okay, next slide, please. Mark? All right, so these are also some types of equipment that may be introduced into virtual power plants. Is anyone familiar with power over Ethernet? So power over Ethernet is basically it's a way of controlling network devices with an Ethernet cable. So for instance, you could actually control the entire lighting system for this building specifically with power over Ethernet. It's really cool stuff. If you haven't learned about it, I would suggest to get on it. Lots of innovations can be made with it. Heat pumps. Can anyone talk about heat pumps? Anyone familiar with them at all? No? Heat pumps they're basically used to pump heat. No, they're used for usually geothermal activity or water heaters, things like that. Home appliances. So electrification is going to be a humongous asset to virtual power plants. Meaning, it's not just as simple as creating the energy and storing the energy, because if the machines that they're powering are not efficient, then that energy is just going to be wasted. So there's a lot of initiatives across America which are introducing electric stoves, electric water heaters, and so forth to basically increase the amount of, or the efficiency level. HVAC equipment is really important. Plug loads, industrial mechanical equipment is going to be a humongous player in the game. So, using backhoes or other electrified equipment is going to be able to have a high density yield for battery pack storage, which could increase the mobility and essentially the efficacy of a virtual power plant. I'm not just. So grid segmentation with virtual power plants will also hedge against inevitable events like we talked about, load shedding and blackouts and natural disasters and so forth. But it'll also improve the controllability of power flows. So it will limit disturbance propagation, reduce cascading outage risks and blackouts, and decrease power system complexity. There was also, I don't know if you all are familiar with this, but there's a mandate called the National Renewable Electricity Mandate. It dictates that 25% of electricity has to come from renewables in the United States by 2030. So that's a pretty huge increase. There's also going to be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from this mandate that should be in the ballpark of about 670 million metric tons per year. And that will account for 11% of all of the US emissions. Okay, we can go to the next page. So I'm guessing that most people in this room are not familiar with the term node. Does anyone know what a node is? Yes.
So, like a physical point, well, I don't know if it's physical or not, where you connect to the grid.
Yeah, exactly. As a form of a metaphor, I like to think of nodes as like leaves on a big tree. So, for instance, a person who has solar panels on their house is one of those leaves on the big tree, that represents the sustainable energy economy. So that kind of relates back to renewable energy source owners, which is not limited to solar panel, which usually is the poster child, but also wind turbines or people who have geothermal units that are set up in their houses, or even hydro dams. Like there's been modest applications where entire farms, for instance, were powered specifically by hydro. Energy storage system operators is going to be there's going to be a massive uptick in that in the near future because modular storage is becoming more accessible. You also have things like lithium ion, is anyone familiar, by the way, with lithium carbon? So lithium carbon is actually going to be one of the next big players in the storage arena because it's easier to harvest. And most of the lithium comes from places like India or Congo, but lithium carbon can actually be harnessed specifically by seawater. Most people don't know that. So also commercial and industrial energy consumers, big warehouses, factories, that kind of thing. residential consumers with smart home devices. I have way too many devices in my house, so I'm definitely one of the leaves on that node. Electric vehicle owners, we spoke about that a little bit earlier, are going to be massive partners with us. And we'll get into all the benefits behind that shortly. Demand response aggregators. So even though my company focuses on mixed assets, we are a demand response provider. And we'll talk about what demand response is later on, if Mark hasn't already explained. Facilities with backup generators, academic institutions are right in that ballpark. Utilities and energy retailers, energy service companies, ESCOs, we'll talk about that shortly. And it's also worth mentioning that there's a company out of New York called Block Power. They're an ESCO. They have a state contract for electrification to electrify buildings for low-income houses. They're currently working in a number of municipalities right now. They're adding new electrical appliances and transitional equipment like electric water heaters, which will reduce carbon emissions, as well as putting solar panels on multi-unit family buildings. Mark, if you wouldn't mind. And that's it. That's my presentation. Just kidding. I just had to throw that in there. But I have everyone's attention. Everyone's understand so far? Okay, good. All right, so let's get into the fun stuff. So let's talk about energy generator types. Who can name one? Anybody? Throw it out there. Energy generator. You can name one on there, right? If you want to cheat. A wind farm. Anyone else? Solar farm. Hydro. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Solar roof panel. Yeah, no, solar roof panels.
Solar roof panels. That's right. Thank you. All right. So this is a diagram of a typical mixed asset virtual power plant and how it sort of breaks down. We can go to the next slide. So the first one, and as I said, big poster child right now, are residential nodes. A lot of our work does come from residential installations. We've done way too many to count across the United States. But that's basically what it looks like. Next slide. This is one of our first nodes that went online. I believe this was 2 or 3 years ago. Is anyone familiar with inverter-based resources, or IBR at all? No? We're gonna have fun today. So this was actually a 6 kilowatt system that we installed on the west side of Chicago, I believe around Oak Park, if I'm not mistaken, something like that. That's why the bars are on the windows. So oftentimes what happens with virtual power plants are they're normally relegated toward mixed or low income houses. Usually people who are in the higher tax bracket don't necessarily have as many installations as people who are at or below the poverty line, which is ironic. That's actually what drew me to Illinois Solar for All. We can go to the next slide. So the way residential nodes support the virtual power plant is through demand response and load shifting, community-wide energy storage and distribution. So as you can imagine, having a community with, say, 1,000 houses and everyone has solar panels on them, that's a pretty big yield. Financial incentives and cost savings. Like around America, I'm not sure in other countries, but there's all sorts of things like renewable energy credits. You guys are familiar with those, right? Or like at the SREC program, Solar Renewable Energy Credit System. Local grid support and community benefits are massive because, as I mentioned before, even around Illinois, there's tons of places that have rolling blackouts. And subsequently, if you have a community with thousands of solar panels, you're reducing the strain on the grid, you're providing more energy independence to that community. Emergency power support. Has anyone in here ever been a part of a natural disaster? Floods, earthquakes, anything like that? If you had to guess, though, what would be the first thing that you would think goes out during a natural disaster? Your power, of course. Blackouts, it's terrifying. I did some work with my company in the Dominican Republic, and we're all familiar with Hurricane Maria, right? Okay, so you know that decimated a lot of parts of the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, Bahamas. There's islands that don't even exist anymore because of one hurricane. You know, even though the Dominican Republic was least affected compared to its neighboring country, Haiti, it still dealt with all sorts of crazy issues. I begged and pleaded with the governments over there, like, hey, let's just adopt a small pilot program. Let's just see if this thing will work. Of course, corruption corrupts, absolutely, right? So we did what we could, and we actually installed I think it was a 2-megawatt solar farm, which is responsible for supplying a modest amount of power to the country right now. Also, innovative energy solutions and market participation are incredibly important at this stage because, as we all know, renewable energy has been suppressed astronomically throughout the world for the past 70 years. So everything that we're doing right now is kind of Captain Ahab-ish, meaning like this is first man on the moon. This is all first data. This is first movers in a market, and we don't know everything. The more data that we have to collect and aggregate, the more we can start to pull from. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, next slide. All right, so let's talk about large scale stuff. Solar farms. This is our chief engineer, Jeff, by the way. We helped with the ECP process of a solar farm in Rockford. We can go to the next slide. So with large scale renewable energy generation, naturally you're talking on the gigawatt level that could support entire cities, perhaps. It provides predictable energy supply. So you can pretty much bet your bottom dollar that the sun is going to come out tomorrow. Grid balancing and stabilization, economies of scale and energy production, support for local grid infrastructure, community solar. Who's familiar with community solar? No? Anyone online familiar with community solar? All right. So think about community solar as a subscriber program, meaning if I have a solar farm somewhere and you say, hey, I'm paying way too much for my energy bill right now. What can I do about this? You don't necessarily have to go with your energy provider, especially in places that have been what's called demonopolized, like Illinois, for instance, which is incredibly corrupt, and we'll talk about that another day. You can actually subscribe to a different energy provider, such as myself, and provide energy at pennies on the dollar. That's what community solar is. Is anyone familiar with carbon credits? Anyone online? Mark, are you familiar with? You're familiar with carbon credits, right?
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Carbon credits provide a financial tool to reward those who offsets. You can buy. I bought one when I flew one time. So my carbon footprint was. They told me for a couple of dollars I could buy a carbon credit, and then that money would be traceable back to some carbon reduction elsewhere. So it's a financial instrument that lets you transfer financing to a solar farm, a wind farm,
Yes,
etc.
exactly.
Like when you buy a plane ticket.
Yes, yes. But for people who are energy generator or who own energy generator systems like solar farms, you can actually you can sell your carbon credits that is offset by the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, and that counts as a carbon credit. So in the instance of we did some work. You just saw the solar farm in Rockford that we worked on. They receive about $250,000 a year for their system that is, I think, 4 gigawatts, something like that. So it's pretty nice, and this is on an annual basis, and you can actually sell those as well. Yes.
Right. So to just reiterate your point, you can both buy and sell.
Yes.
Carbon credits.
That's
in my
correct.
case, I was buying one. Then someone else would turn around and sell the carbon credit to the airline.
That's correct.
And then the airline would take my $2 and give it to, when they add it all up, they give it to the energy provider.
Precisely.
So there's a buy and a sell side to the transaction. We had a question online.
Yes.
Lucas asked, is that tax deductible? Buy carbon credit?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was a joke, but yeah, that is carbon. That's tax deductible because it comes from a federal program.
Thank you.
All right, next, please. All right, commercial buildings. Let's get into it. Next slide. So, commercial buildings are huge. They have a huge footprint, meaning that there's a lot of different things that you can do. Demand response participation is massive, reducing the carbon footprint, grid stabilization, energy cost savings. We talked about POE. So, in the instance of the Willis Tower, which if we look out the window, we can see from where we are right now. I mean, this building is, you know, a lot of stories. I think it's 100 something. So imagine being able to use power over Ethernet to control the entire lighting system for the building, to manage a schedule when people are in the office, out of the office. It literally would save millions of dollars a year just from that building alone.
If I could just interject.
Sure.
On POE.
Yes.
The company Cisco started it mostly in the 1980s, selling routers, Ethernet-based routers to route data. And then in the 1990s and early aughts, they got into telephones, so voice over IP telephones. It's a natural extension, and they can push quite a few watts across these Ethernet, like Cat5 Ethernet is deep wires, right, 4 twisted pairs, and they can push quite a bit of power. So isn't it logical that the same wire that carries your data could also carry enough power to light an LED? It couldn't light an incandescent bulb, but it could light an LED. So Cisco invested in it. Okay, sorry.
No worries. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so also there's massive renewable energy credits that are generated from huge buildings. Smart grid integration is what we're moving toward. And I think in Dubai, like they have one of the most prominent programs right now. Is anyone familiar with the line? It's a new civilization that's going up. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Yeah. That's right. Yes. Anyone else know about the line? Yeah. It's basically going to be the first actual smart city that will be brought online with, I think, in the next 10 years, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me on that. Something like that, though. Yeah, they've already started building it. Yes.
It's in northwest
Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
Red Sea.
That's right. Yes. But also Dubai. I mentioned that for a reason, because Dubai, I mean, it's kind of one of those places that sprung up out of nowhere in the last 40 years, and they've managed to make a lot of technological innovations, including integrating elements of smart city technology into what they do on a day-to-day basis, such as a smart city app. That is like a municipal app that you can pay your tickets and all those kinds of things. Okay, next. So this is actually a diagram of a building that we own. We'll be moving into this building in about April. It's based in Maywood, Illinois. As you can see on the roof, there's a 6 kilowatt system that my engineers put into use, and the students that go through our school, our training, will actually install this entire virtual power plant node. So I think the building itself has a footprint of about 12,000 square feet, something like that. So it's not like massive, but it's pretty decent. And it will power the majority of our training modules. It will power a lot of the electrical systems throughout the building. Okay, next. I put this in there for fun. A friend of mine is a solar installer in Rio de Janeiro. Here we are freezing our butts off in Chicago, and he's living the high life. So I thought that was pretty cool. Thermal power plants. Let's get into that. Next slide. So thermal power plants, they work with ancillary services. They integrate pretty well into renewable energy sources. They have predictable power generation. They optimize efficiency. They offer load balancing. A former president once made a comment that we had clean coal. Doesn't exist. But that's one of the ways thermal power plants work. So they're also really useful. I'm not sure if you all have discussed in class about the finite amount of fossil fuels reserves that we have in the world, but we're ranging about 50 something years, more or less, before that number is depleted. So coal is definitely important right now, but it definitely will not be around forever. There's not an infinite supply of it. Neither is oil. Did you have something you wanted to add?
No, we have talked a little bit about fossil fuels, but that's the subject of the future.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
I think it's important to clarify.
Yes.
When you say thermal power plant, really you mean fossil fuel.
Well, there's multiple versions of it, so I didn't really have time to get into every single version. So I just said, fossil fuels. Yeah. But I mean, you could label geothermal as thermal. So yeah.
It's heat-based.
Heat-based. Yeah. Yeah. Alrighty. Okay, let's talk about wind farms. Next slide. So I wanted to break this down into a bifurcation of both offshore and onshore because they both offer different pros and cons. For offshore, it obviously complements onshore renewable sources. It minimizes land use impact because it's in water, facilitates energy diversification. It also supports marine ecosystem conservation. So wherever these offshore wind farms are created, it basically becomes like a safe haven where there's no fishing zones or anything like that. Onshore is different. So they can be rapidly deployed and constructed. I don't know if anyone has any experience in the room with wind, but it's really exciting stuff. It creates local economic development. If any of you have ever taken a trip downstate, there's miles and miles of wind farms. I like to just stop off and watch them spin sometimes. It's really cool. There's scalable and flexible power production. So a single wind turbine can be erected in more or less 5 days or so and be commissioned and put online. And you can do this almost infinitely in places that have open arid land. So that leads up to land use efficiency. Any questions so far before I go on?
Yeah. Did you have a question, Lucas?
Yeah, I had a question about the wind farms, for example.
Yep.
Everybody tends to talk about solar panels on your house, so on and so forth. Why isn't wind technology common for residential as well? Don't they have like smaller wind turbines that you can use for your home?
Yeah, there are, but the problem is you need a fairly large one to generate enough of a current to actually be meaningful. So, I mean, you could have a small wind turbine on your house if you had farmland, but I mean, you're not really going to generate much energy at all if you just have tiny ones. So that's kind of where the trough of sorrow is, so to speak. But from what I understand, and that's a great question. Thank you for that. There are bladeless wind turbines that are becoming more popular, and once those start to take effect in urban areas, now we're looking at something meaningful. Now you can also have your residential solar panels, but also bladeless turbines that no one even knows what they are in a key, like a target spot around your backyard, for instance. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. All right, let's talk about geothermal. So there's incredibly high energy efficiency. But before I get into that, is anyone familiar with how geothermal works? No?
Yes. Basically, you dig into the ground, and you run lines in the ground, and because the temperature underground is basically stable in a range, you're able to use that in order to heat and cool your house.
Exactly. Yes, that's definitely one form of geothermal activity. Another would be using, for instance, volcanoes or underwater rivers that are heated, and so you can convert that heat into steam. So with that, because they have minimal land footprint, that usually they're underground. And Mark, you spoke about South Dakota. What was that? The geysers, right?
Well, yeah, the food protein company that discovered within the Yellowstone National Park.
Yes, in Yellowstone, right. Okay. So that's actually a form of geothermal energy. So there's reduced dependency on weather conditions because as the person online commented, everything is happening underground, which can relate to either heating or cooling or converting steam into electricity. So there's long-term sustainable, it is a long-term sustainable energy source. It's complementary, very low operational and maintenance costs, because this does technically fall under the spectrum of HVAC. And also there's a potential for direct heating application, which I mentioned. Okay, we can move on. All right, so hydro dams, one of my favorites. We can go on. So many people don't know this, but a large portion of the energy production in the west coast of America actually does come from hydro dams. Is anyone familiar with the Hoover Dam? Does anyone know where that's located? It's located in Nevada.
Stefana, did you want to say something?
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a really exciting use of energy. It's been used for thousands of years. I mean, even if you go back to Mesopotamia, or even in more modern times with the Dutch, you know, the windmills and so forth. So it has very low operational costs, energy storage through pumped hydro. It's emission-free, which is great. And wildlife and ecosystem conservation efforts have been put in place for hydro dams. So even a good example is like salmon going upstream, going for mating and that kind of stuff. It's put in place for a reason, and it keeps the ecosystem in balance, which is awesome. Next slide, please.
Learning mouse has to be on the screen.
All right, tidal energy. Who's familiar with that? Yeah? You want to talk about it? That's right. Yes, exactly. It's an infinite amount of energy, yes. And by the way, most people don't know this, but the tidal energy is in lunar lock with the moon. So it's because of the moon's gravitational pull that the tidal waves exist. We can go to the next slide. So flood control, water management, support for local grid infrastructure, very low operational costs, because once you actually do set the turbines up and they start to spin, unless something breaks, there's very little that you need to do, and they will just continue to spin 24 hours a day. I'm sorry? You said what about the maintenance? I mean, things break, you know. But the great thing about wind turbines is the blades themselves are fairly easy to replace, and they're not super expensive. So, and I'd mentioned as well bladeless turbines, which are huge. So, you know, once those start to be implemented in underground or underwater tidal farms, you're talking, you know, the energy efficiency and capacity is going to increase exponentially. Yes?
I was going to ask, because I was wondering before, now you said it again, how do these bladeless turbines work?
It's basically just an oscillator. So instead of having the blades themselves turn around, you have like a column, and water or wind would go through it, spinning an oscillator. The oscillator creates electricity. Make sense? Yeah. Okay. Also, energy storage through pumped hydro, really cool. It's emission-free, and wildlife and ecosystem conservation is really important, because, as we all know, the oceans are becoming overfished. And it's also leading to high acidity content of the oceans, which means that eventually it will boil and we will not be able to use it. So let's not do that. Next, please. Nuclear power. All right, so nuclear power has been under a lot of scrutiny. We go back to Fukushima, Chernobyl, you know, all of these 3 Mile Island, like there's all sorts of incidents that occur in remote situations, but realistically, it's not as bad as everyone makes it seems. And what's more is these events occurred a very long time ago. I think that nuclear power has become sort of the boogeyman of the energy space, because you look at these events where, by the way, very few people have died. More people die from smoking in a single day than have died in all those accidents combined. But because the narrative has been pushed that nuclear power is bad, that means we're not able to progress with sustainable energy as fast as we should. But I believe virtual power plants are incredibly important because they're going to integrate everything. It's important to not rely on just a single energy source. You should have all of them working together simultaneously. They have minimal land footprint. Homer Simpson works there, one of my favorite guys. There's enhanced energy security, continuous power supply, and very minimal dependence on fossil fuels. So very cool stuff. Did you want to add anything?
Well, most of the scenarios we look at for nuclear power from the International Energy Agency show it kind of hovering around 10% of supply, but much of the investment we look at in the DC slide is in the small modular reactor. And so we'll look at that in a future lecture, but it's absolutely, it's one of the wild cards in the energy transition. How much we talked about Bellows home country, 70-80%. 50 of electricity generation is 50%. Illinois is probably not that different.
Yes.
France and Illinois are outliers in terms of being high percentage nuclear. And then if you look at small modular reactors, they've been proven in submarine applications.
That's correct.
So,
yep.
But David's absolutely right. The issue is both safety and perception, and the perception of safety.
Thank you. Okay, we can move on. Peaker plants. Who's familiar with those? You're going to love this. Next slide, please. So basically what a peaker plant is, it's kind of like a reserve system, if you will. In the instance in Chicago, we've been experiencing negative temperatures for almost 2 weeks at a point, which means every single building that is inhabited is running their heater, right? There is a threshold that has to be maintained. I don't know what it is in Chicago, but in other places it's somewhere around 110% energy capacity. And as you run heaters, it goes down, it decreases rapidly. And so that leads to blackouts and brownouts, load shedding, all sorts of things that we don't want to happen. In the event of that, those events taking place or getting close to it, peaker plants will kick on and they burn fossil fuels and they say, okay, well, let's push some energy back into the grid and that will keep us sustainable, keep a robust environment, and keep everything running like clockwork. Does that make sense? Good. So this minimizes electricity price volatility. It complies with grid operation standards. And as I said, it really is important for predominantly emergency backups during grid disruptions and load balancing. Okay, we can go to the next slide. How much time do we have, by the way?
Well, I think if you can go about 5 or 10 more minutes, we'll take a break.
Okay, great.
And then come back and get as much more time as you need.
Perfect. Vehicle to grid. This is going to be exciting stuff. So as I'd mentioned before, one of the types of virtual power plants that exists independently or collectively is vehicle to grid. Essentially what that does is provide emergency power supply. So did you all by chance watch the news recently when there was like lines and lines of Teslas that were not working because they couldn't be charged because of the battery issues and so forth? This would alleviate that. Eventually, when there are more chargers around Illinois, around the world, they can pull from each other's battery supply. Even, by the way, even when the electric vehicle is plugged into a house, that acts as something that could power that house, or it could power the existing grid or microgrids, etc. So there's tons of cost savings. It enhances grid resiliency, which is that was my roundabout way of saying that. And it provides reduced infrastructural strain because, I think we really did kind of hit a speed bump when we were projected to have 30 million vehicles on the road with literally no way to charge them. Okay, next. This is a fun project that my company is working on right now. We are introducing the first grid-tied ice cream truck. So we're actually going to be developing this vehicle. It will have a 4 kilowatt system. It will be able to tie into the grid to charge its batteries, but also to share energy back into the grid. So that will be one of one. Going to be very exciting. Okay, we can move on.
That's in Chicago.
That's in Chicago, yes. Yes, that's happening literally right now. We can go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to talk about lesser known energy sources. Is anyone familiar with salinity gradient power, or blue energy? No? Okay, so blue energy is this. In places where seas and fresh water bodies converge, you have this exchange of salt particles. And what happens is you can pull power from that through electrolysis. Most people don't know that. Microbial fuel cells, algae biofuel, piezoelectric energy harvesting, which uses, if I'm not mistaken, you probably shouldn't quote me on this, but I think it uses some form of, percussion, like it's stomping on the ground, things like that. Artificial photosynthesis, tidal lagoons. Is anyone familiar with like tidal lagoons? Okay. Yes?
I guess from the name.
Yeah. Basically, you create like you can create a whirlpool effect, and then you put a turbine at the center of it, in like, for instance, a river, and it go around and it creates energy from that by spinning the turbine. And also biogas from food waste. We can go ahead because I think we're getting close to the end of the first part. All right, so DER integration. Let's go into that real quick. So distributed energy resources, we've just gone through all of the predominantly public ways that they integrate, like all the different types of energy generators, but let's see how the entire puzzle fits together. So that's essentially what a virtual power plant looks like, and the different assets, different types of energy trades, and the amount of data sets that it produces. Next slide. This is a pictograph of how our virtual power plant works. So this is our company in the center. We rely on battery storage. That big blue logo is our product called Parsec, which is an energy management system. So we basically manage that through here. This is our energy portfolio of all of the different assets that we have. We do e-governance, which I'll get into in a moment. Property owners, we install their systems. They use Parsec to sell their unused energy back to the grid. Goes through e-governance. Grid operators rely on the delivery systems as well as their own energy generation. They use Parsec to filter all of this energy out to the masses. Make sense? Good. Okay. All right. Any computer science people in here? Oh, I was hoping someone would say yes. I'm a computer science nerd, so I'm going to have fun.
Online. Online computer science?
No? No worries. I'm going to have fun. Next slide, please. Who's familiar with smart metering? No? Interesting. Mark, do you want to take this one?
Well, we talked about in earlier classes, or third class, but week 1 or week 2, we talked about the grand convergence of ICT, information and communication technology, and energy systems. And that maybe it's fortuitous that we live in an age of AI and info tech. At the same time, the climate system has gotten chaotic. So, we were talking earlier, Paulo and I, necessity is the mother of invention. You know, like in this case, it's the fortuitous confluence of ICT and so smart metering is one way in which, generally speaking, at least historically, the utilities have used computers and data networks to try and optimize the energy system from their end.
Mm-hmm.
But it's only the beginning.
Yeah.
So smart. It depends how you define smart meter.
Mm-hmm.
The commonly used term is a load side meter. Your house or your building, your commercial building operator, is the load side of the meter, and then the demand side of the meter, or the supply side of the meter, is the utility side. And there's physically a demarcation point in the box. So everything from this point forward is the load side, and everything from this part back is the utility side. And that's all being scrambled and challenged because of the smart meters, and smart networks. So if I put my own smart meter on my electricity panel in my house, and it measures, I use, let's say, the house uses what, 1,000 kilowatts.
Something like that, yeah.
Maybe in a month I've used 30, help me out here, 50,000 kilowatt hours, 50 kilowatt hours,
Mhm.
500 kilowatt hours.
500, yeah.
That would be a 50 building. 500 kilowatt hours, that would be a typical house, right? Small house. And the utility measures 600 kilowatt hours. Who's right? Can I take them to court and say I'm not paying your bill because I measured it on my side of the meter? I have a different number than you. So, it's an interesting question. First of all, what is a smart meter? The computer is measuring electricity metering it. Second of all, who owns that meter? Who owns the data?
Mhm.
It raises a lot. It's a whole can of worms.
Yes. Thank you.
That's a long-winded answer to the question, what's a smart meter?
Yep. Yeah. So basically, it's a form of data tracking. When you use an appliance or something, it calculates how much kilowatt hours have been used, and then it stores those, and then the energy company reads the meter and bills you accordingly based upon whatever the cost is per kilowatt hour. Next slide, please. I know we have to rush, though. AMI deals with smart meters, two-way communication, remote monitoring. So utility companies and organizations like mine, we can monitor what's going on in real time, very much like a command center, if you will. And then integration with IoT. Is anyone familiar with IoT? So, yes? So IoT is the Internet of Things, and it's basically any device that generates data. So it could be your car, it could be a cat collar, it could be whatever, a refrigerator. AIoT is slightly different. Anyone familiar with AIoT? So that's the artificial intelligence Internet of Things, which basically it allows for decision making to happen from that device. There was a very funny joke when Tesla first came out. Obviously, the product never rolled out, but if your car needed maintenance, the car would be able to drive itself to like a mechanic shop, and you'd be stuck with a $1,200 bill or something like that. But the car is able to basically self-diagnose. Similarly, anything that's plugged into a virtual power plant can self-diagnose and tell you how much energy is generating, how much is being used, and so on. All sorts of data points, which could be infinite. Does that make sense? Good. Okay, next slide. All right, we can go on to that.
This would be a good point to break. This is the time to use it. Or do you want to do a couple more?
Just a couple more, because I think we are just. You know what? Let's break. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's break. Cool. So we left off. We were just getting into virtual power plant algorithms. So I wanted to walk through a couple of formulas that are used to dictate things like pricing, for instance. Could you go to the next slide, if you don't mind? So the formula on the board is nonlinear mixed integer programming. So it's used for optimal dispatch, what's the best way that that energy should be shared via an algorithm that either works with a power company or, in this case, can be translated into code. So with software programming, it's important to understand how not to overload the system or to underwhelm it. Does that make sense? Okay. So sigma representing like the entire equation, power introduction, time, generation variables such as the solar and all of the other generative properties that we talked about. Sigma here representing the entire equation, minus the amount of power constraints, time, and the available amount of energy. Does that make sense? No?
I mean, there are some letters that I don't know what they are. For example, C.
See? Just that means C is constraints. So things that limit the ability for the system to function well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's move on. Can I erase this? Okay. And I also forgot to mention binary variables. So things that may have more than one way of explaining them. So let's see, like a ramp rate, for instance. Is anyone familiar with ramp rates? So a ramp rate is basically like how much, how to explain? It limits or increases the amount of energy that can be increased or decreased. Does that make sense? Okay. We can go to the next one. Is anyone familiar with power purchase agreements? So basically, a power purchase agreement it's a contract that is made between an energy purchaser like an ISO and the energy generator. So in my instance, if I own a solar farm, I can create a power purchase agreement that says my 4 gigawatt solar farm will sell 2 gigawatts to the city of Chicago at this amount. Make sense? That's basically what it is. But you also have like bidding strategies and a scheduling model. So this between the variables of understanding whatever the amount of pricing is for a city or any general demographic, that will determine that model, as well as the constraints, and then scheduling. So will it be that this company purchases energy on a yearly basis, on a monthly basis, weekly, or what have you? Does everyone understand that? Yes? Okay.
Can I get something in there?
Sure.
I just want to say, when he mentioned PPAs, they're called power purchase agreements, are a very important concept to get to know. So we'll probably talk about it again down the line. It's how it's a contract where if you're a power producer, you're guaranteed revenue for the power. You've got someone I'll take that power. The world that David's working in, which is distributed energy resources, doesn't work through the ISOs. It works through other mechanisms I'll explain. There's going to be these new market structures that are going to change the nature of PPAs. Does that make sense, David?
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to make sure you kind of listen up to this. Power purchase agreements are important and changing.
I'm going to write a little bit quickly. Okay, so in this formula, sigma representing the entire formula, P would represent market price, B would represent your bid quantity, so how much energy you're going to purchase, and then C, of course, represents constraints like the amount of energy flow that is lost during transmission or down power lines. I mean, just anything that could limit the amount of delivery or the quality of service. So that's what the formula looks like for upper level bidding strategy. And this is, when we get to energy blockchain, you'll see how all of this more or less makes sense. Does everyone understand this so far? Excellent. Okay, next slide. Stochastic pricing. So it's a model for virtual power plants comprising intermittent sources, storage facilities, and dispatchable power plants seeking to maximize expected profit in day ahead and balancing markets. So basically what that means is it's able to forecast how much energy will cost the next day, in a very short explanation. So it can be used in demand response, which is what I said we would get into a little bit later on. Demand response, to summarize it, it's basically the response, or excuse me, the demand of energy products in places like what we're going through right now. So if it's really hot, if it's really cold, if any kind of extremities that happen, you're going to have an uptick in pricing and an uptick in usage. So that's demand response. Basically says, okay, well, we know that people are coming home from work at 5 o'clock. Everyone's going to be turning on their TVs, their different appliances and so forth, and getting prepared for the next day. So that's when you can expect the demand to rise. Make sense? But we know for sure that the lowest usage times are going to be between, say, 10 o'clock and 4 p.m. when everyone's working, because no one's home. Okay. So in this scenario, sigma represents all. S represents the set of scenarios across different states and territories. T represents time. P represents probability of the scenario recurring. And the rest of it is self-explanatory, so that's going to be revenue minus the actual cost of whatever the energy product is. So in this case, as I said before, there's going to be different set scenarios, meaning you're going to have people going to work at 9 o'clock, getting off, coming home around 5 o'clock-ish. That's a set scenario. It's never going to change unless we have another COVID or something. Then the amount of time for delivery, or the time of usage, which could be translated to kilowatt hours, and then the probability of scenarios occurring. So that's a fixed, but there could also be variables where there's blackouts, or there's natural disasters, or someone gets a new PlayStation 5. Who knows? All sorts of things will increase that value. Does this make sense, everyone? Yes? I'm making sense, right, Mark?
Making sense.
Good.
It's about probability. Right?
Yes.
Probabilistic.
Correct.
Weather events is one of the.
Yes, that's something I mentioned. Did not mention. Weather events is important. By the way, all of these notes will be available eventually. I just have to condense my crazy thoughts down. Next slide, please. Is anyone familiar with Power to X? Where's my? No, it's on here. Okay. So it's simple. Power to X is basically the amount of surplus electricity that comes from any generator, and it's turned into something else. And so Power to X could represent, and you can go to the next slide, actually. So that's the formula for it. This character represents the amount of efficiency. So the typical efficiency rate of any energy generator hovers around 22%. It could be combustibles, fossil fuels, solar, you name it. It's more or less around 22%. So then P represents the amount of total power generated by a virtual power plant. And in this case, I just put together a magical scenario. So I just said, if there was a 6 gigawatt solar farm that existed, that it would operate, you would be able to share roughly 0.22% back into the grid, and that would be 1.32 gigawatts, which would be available to be converted into other things. And I have an example of other things on the next slide. So this is an example. So I chose to use power to mobility. because as you see in this diagram, a car is charging with solar panels. So whatever energy is not used by the primary device can be shared back into cars. It could be power to grid, power to gas, power to liquid, which in this case could be like methane, power to chemicals, power to heat, and then also power to power, believe it or not. Does that make sense? Okay. We can go to the next slide.
Quick question.
Yes.
What's the main reason it drops down to 22%? Any big factors in that conversion?
Yeah, so it hovers around 22% because that's just the efficiency level of any energy generator system. So if you talk gasoline, solar power, wind, whatever, that's just what it's more or less at. And I mean, that number could fluctuate by a few percentages, but you're never going to find an energy generator that's 100% or not even close to that. Does that make sense?
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so let's talk energy management systems. For obvious reasons, I chose the one that my company created, which is called Parsec, and it allows us to view a dashboard of all of the different portfolio assets we have. So it could be, I obviously had to block a lot of the real stuff out, but this is an example. So we could have residential solar, wind turbines, hydro dams, all of these things generating power. We can read them in real time due to IoT installations that are part of the inverter. We can go on. So what you're looking at is the first iteration of Parsec, and as you can see here, there's a number of tabs that allow us to view various components and functionalities of the web app. So in this instance, you can see that these orange dots are actual nodes on our network. You click on them, you would be able to see the amount of PV input. You can see the AC load. You can see how much data has been generated. You can see the amperage, or the current rather. But you can also check to see your solar savings, fault passage indicator. In case anyone doesn't understand what a fault passage indicator is, it's basically a device that detects irregularities in a system. So if a squirrel falls on a tree or on a transmission line and fries itself and the grid blows up, now you have a place to know where to start, or something like that. Make sense? Okay. You would also be able to add a device on the screen. So for instance, if you mentioned that you had a house in Torremolinos, if you wanted to make yourself part of our grid network, you could actually purchase a component from us. If you had solar panels or other forms of generation, plug that in, turn on the internet, and now you're part of our network. And then from there, you would be able to make decisions with us and be a friend. Does that make sense so far, everyone? Good. Okay, we can go on. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yes.
Okay. So let's talk about energy forecasting and predictive analytics. We can go on. So what you're looking at is a forecasting screen from our system, which determines how much kilowatt usage you would see over a fluctuating period. And I just chose a 5-day period, 6-day period rather, to determine how much is used, how much cost would be, and how much consumption. But this is a typical diagram of what you should expect from a fairly large system, actually, or fairly large community, I should say. Yeah, and then also very much like the stock market, you can see fluctuations of it going up, down, so forth. But the energy economy really is a kind of living, breathing organism, and it's time that we start treating it as such. Okay, ready. All right, let's talk about a few case studies. You can go on. Who's familiar with the big freeze that happened? What was that, 2021? 2020, something like that?
20 or 21, 22, I think.
Yeah. Is anyone familiar with what happened in Texas? Okay, so funny story. Texas thinks of itself as its own country. And as such, they have their own grid that is not tied into any of the other regional transmission operators, and I'll have a map of that coming up. So what happened is ERCOT, which is, that's the name of their grid system, froze and shut down because they got hit with so much snow and so much freeze that wind turbines stopped turning, assets just started breaking down. They got to a point where they were moments away from the system being irreparable, meaning there would be billions of dollars in damage and the entire system would have to be replaced. So as a result of that, what Texas decided to do was to implement a virtual power plant pilot program in 2021, I believe it was, just shortly after the big freeze. My organization participates in it, and ultimately what they're trying to do is to just see how this would affect the grid as a whole before they do anything like plug into other grids and kind of disrupt their way of life. So right now they're taking subscribers, like if you actually do generate power, if you have wind turbines or solar panels or other implementations, you can do that, but also as a subscriber to receive that power. So that's happening right now. Next. Does anyone remember the big fire that happened in South Australia, like the big brush fire? Destroyed a lot of stuff. You're talking, it racked up billions of dollars in damages. So what Tesla did is they implemented a pilot program in South Australia that would affect 50,000 homes. They want to have a 250 megawatt portfolio that they would manage, which would have 650 megawatt hours of battery backup from their Tesla power walls. And right now they are in the middle of phase 4, I believe. So right now, as I said earlier, we're still very much in the learning stage of how virtual power plants interact with each other, how the entire ecosystem functions, and the data that supports all of the evidence that this will or will not be successful. But I believe it will be. I should have got some water. Is anyone familiar with inverter-based resources? Nope. Okay, so an inverter-based resource is anything that converts DC to AC, so direct current to alternating current. We can go to the next slide, Mark. So this is a video of one of the IBRs that we put in place. He's not really moving that slowly.
These indicator lights on the side? Like. Put it off.
There's more. Did it freeze? There it goes. Okay, so in short, this is a 5 kilowatt ground mounted system that we installed in one of the largest Black-owned farms in Illinois, and it literally powers their entire campus. And this is well over 150 acres. Yeah, so this was a pretty big step for us. This was actually one of the first commercial implementations of an IBR that we were a part of. Very exciting time. Any questions so far? No? Okay, next. Here we go, energy blockchain. Is anyone familiar with the energy blockchain? No. Does everyone knows about the blockchain, right? Cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, those kinds of things. So basically, the blockchain is a digital ledger. It's just a way of time stamping when a transaction took place. It's not as fancy as everyone makes it seem. It's just this person, what was your name again? Pablo, right? Okay, so Pablo gives me $1 at 8:30 p.m. In this room, and that's what the blockchain transaction will register. The difference with an energy blockchain is it registers how much energy is traded, how much data is used, and so on. I gave you guys the energy report. Did anyone read it? That's reassuring.
It was assigned reading for this week. The Lumena Energy website. Okay.
No worries.
Let me just add the blockchain, just
Yeah.
for your definition before we get into the energy blockchain.
Mhm.
What makes a blockchain different than, let's say, any other ledger like a spreadsheet is that it's cryptographically secure and it's decentralized.
Yes.
So there are multiple copies automatically replicated and it's secured with cryptography.
Mhm.
And so even though it's called a trustless system because there's no central authority that you can turn to guarantee its trustworthiness, it can be trusted because of mathematics. So all you have to believe to trust blockchain is that the math works. And so that's why it's been a big deal on things like Bitcoin, et cetera.
Sure.
Sprung up on it.
Mhm.
Now let's talk about how the blockchain relates to energy.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
You can go to the next slide. All right, so to piggyback off what Mark was saying, it increases transparency and traceability. So there wouldn't be a scenario, or theoretically there should not be a scenario where someone can game the system. If you recall from Parsec, from the dashboard, you can see different territories across the United States. With the energy blockchain, someone wouldn't be able to say, hey, I have a 100 million megawatt system in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, because that defeats the purpose. So it improves your security and data integrity. It provides decentralized energy trading. So it makes it so a single organization would not be responsible. Instead, it would be up to everyone to make those trades. And there's also real-time settlement and billing. As I was saying before, if Pablo, for instance, gave me $1, you would be able to see that, and you could go back at any point in time and retrace whenever that, well, all of the components of that transaction history. Uh-oh, what happened?
Sorry.
No worries. Okay. So that leads us actually to the facilitation of peer-to-peer energy transactions, meaning I could sell an energy trade to Pablo and he could sell one to me. Is anyone familiar with smart contracts? You're going to love this. So a smart contract is basically a digital contract that is created with code that would, for instance, say, it would outline all of the details of an arrangement, but you would be able to access this digitally and it would be executable digitally. So for instance, if we created a company online using a smart contract that says everyone in this room has to be paid $500 on the first of the month, then that contract would automatically create bank transactions and send that money to each and every one of you automatically. So it becomes autonomous. Does that make sense? There's reduced operational costs. We personally use Ethereum. Is anyone familiar with the cryptocurrency Ethereum? Okay. So we use Ethereum, the Ethereum blockchain for all of our transactions. This increases regulatory compliance. So in the instance that Mark brought up earlier, where if an organization says, hey, we have 600 kilowatt hours that you've used, but your machine only says 500, you would be able to go online and see exactly how much those transactions were timestamped for the amount, the quantity, and all of the times that they were used. Does that make sense? Yes? Good. And this essentially allows for the scalability of actual energy networks. So instead of relying on centralized distributors, now you can build up companies like mine, which are, we're nowhere near as big as ComEd or other energy suppliers. And that goes to data-driven decision making. So, and now we could actually rely on the analytics that we spoke of before. So you could actually see from a day-to-day basis how much energy would be used, how much would be required, and then all the systems that would participate to know exactly how much you would have to pay for those services. Make sense? Good. Okay, next. This is an actual blockchain transaction that my company did on a device that we manage in Arizona. If you all do get the chance, I would encourage you to read the energy report that Mark sent out, because it will detail just like 8 pages worth of transactions. So here you can see the load, the kilowatt hour, the amount of data that's used, and the amount of energy trades per watt. And then you see it's time-stamped January 2022. And also it goes down to the millisecond to know exactly when those trades took place. Make sense? We can go on. I want to talk about the next generation of inverters. Everyone is familiar with how an inverter works? Yeah? Okay. So in a nutshell, it converts DC power to AC power, which makes it usable. You can plug it into wall socket, etc. But the problem that exists now that we're getting into the energy blockchain is you have to use a completely secondary system just to even do those transactions. It doesn't make any sense. So now my company is working on developing the Arcolith, which has a, you know what a GPU is? Like a, no? It's basically it's a processor that allows for blockchain transactions to occur. It has predictive maintenance, network energy forecasting. Each of these units would be placed on any of the nodes that we have available. So for instance, solar, like if someone had residential solar, we would put this in place of a standard solar inverter, and now they would be able to do energy trade transactions directly from their phone, as opposed to looking at a smart meter, which is way more intuitive. It happens instantaneously, available 24 hours a day. And I mean, if you think about that from a volume-based scale, in a place like Chicago where there's, I don't know, 2 million people, if 2 million of those people had these devices, now you know exactly how much energy is being shared. Now that's the definition of a smart city. When you can see the data happening in real time and you can process it, and you can use it to make actual decisions. So that's coming up. And it ultimately allows for peer-to-peer energy trading. Next. So the advantages are the enhancement of virtual power plant proliferation, meaning other virtual power plants can go online anywhere in the world, increased security and scalability. So basically right now, if someone wanted to hack into Chicago's grid, they would just have to go through ComEd. But in order to hack into something like this, you would have to hack every single device, which is way harder. No one's going to waste their time hacking 2 million devices. And especially with the amount of AIoT, at the level that we're at, we would catch the first, I guess, error in the system immediately. So that makes everything way more trustless, as Mark said, and it's way more reliable. So this, I think, is a uniform solution to the energy blockchain. Any questions so far? Okay, next. Is anyone familiar with phase-locked loop algorithms? Okay, no worries. I know this information may be a little bit over your heads, but you got to learn someday. A phase-locked loop is basically the frequency on which energy vibrates, right? And in order for energy to flow to actually form a load, both of those sine waves have to look like this. And if they don't, you're going to blow up something. So this is actually a sample algorithm that we developed in Python, which will work with the Arcolith blockchain inverter. So you will actually be able to manage your phase lock loop remotely. Okay, we can go on. So this is a diagram of what that frequency should look like in a perfect scenario. Did you want to talk about phase lock loops or anything, or did you have anything to add?
You know, we have 2 electricians in the class. I don't know if any of them want to comment. I assume that it's related to transmission of alternating current.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it's not an issue with direct current. So after you've converted it to alternating current, you have to maintain power quality.
That's correct. Yes.
And it's a power engineering issue that I'm not familiar enough with,
Mm-hmm.
except to understand that it's important. If you talk to electricians,
Yes.
it's an important part of energy.
Correct.
Any of the electricians in the class want to jump in and comment? I'll probably open up some of these issues on a discussion board, so you guys can, make comments, after the class, anytime during the semester on some of these concepts. The idea here is decentralization, just as, it used to be stock markets were centralized. You have to go to the New York Stock Exchange. No one could sure trading their own stocks, being a day trader, trading on their own.
Mm-hmm.
And the vision here is that energy may follow the same path. Instead of trusting the utility to manage it all, that there would be a role for markets, decentralized markets.
Correct.
Is that a fair way to?
That's perfect. Yeah, that's actually what I was leading into. So the energy market is evolving in such a way that it really is becoming like a living, breathing organism, and the average consumer will be able to have a say-so in those transactions, in those trades, and you'll be able to make money off of it and have a better quality of life because of it. Okay, next. We can skip that. Energy storage. All right. Let's. To cap off the last of the components that are required for virtual power plants, energy storage, because once energy is generated, it has to be stored somewhere, or what's the point? So we're looking at an era now where modular storage containers are becoming a much more important thing. We're using elements like lithium ion, lithium carbon, gel-based storage, and so on to create like a high density storage battery. And when used by scale, that means now we could have a seemingly infinite amount of energy available at our fingertips. So we would be able to manage peak load and shaving, grid balancing and frequency regulation, demand response optimization. So being able to pull from some of the remote areas that use battery storage means like now you don't have to worry about blackouts, and it really does form like an emergency backup system. Energy arbitrage opportunities, voltage support and power quality improvement, reduction of energy transmission losses. As I said before, one of the factors that goes into some of the algorithms I put on the board is energy loss, because once energy travels through a power line, not all of it will reach its destination. So being able to store it in a battery pack makes it so it's more efficient. And it defers grid infrastructure upgrades. So if a component is broken, like a substation, for instance, you would be able to store that energy and still be able to pass it depending on the configuration of the grid infrastructure. Okay, next. How much time do we have?
Figure 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Sure. Okay, we can go on. Next. All right, so let's talk about workforce. As I'd said before, one of the underpinned issues with getting us to scale is we don't have enough people to fill these jobs. What was your name again? Othello, right. So Othello mentioned while you all were on break that he wants, if he's offered a job in America, to come here and work. We're expecting a need for more than 10 million renewable energy workers within the next 10 years. So Othello would be a welcomed asset to the team. But that also speaks to the entire global society. Without enough workforce development training or people to fill that need, we kind of run into a wall. Okay, next. We can skip that. Skip that.
This is the future of Lumena carrying solar batteries to
So the largest black-owned
You can
farm
skip
in
it.
Illinois.
So this is our office in the Willis Tower. This was a solar training program that we implemented. This was the final test where they had to connect two different battery sources to a monocrystalline and a polycrystalline solar panel. You can skip it because I know we don't have much time. All right, so let's talk about this real quick. The Renewable Energy Decentralized Autonomous Organization is a form of e-governance that I invented, which essentially adds all of those components we talked about before. So the energy blockchain, smart contracts, and democratization all together. You can skip. So this was an actual pilot program that we implemented in Maywood, Illinois, where we allowed people who had solar panels on their houses to participate in a democracy program where they were able to vote on various things like how much they should charge for their energy generation on a kilowatt hour basis. And that went under the power purchase agreement. The grid improvement initiative was really important because, as I said, certain areas have things that are broken that sometimes are never addressed, or the machinery, the equipment is very old. So this allows them to the standard citizen to voice their concern, and also for incentive programs. So I think, Mark, you mentioned prosumers earlier. So this allows a person to be both a producer and a consumer. Meaning, if they have solar panels on their house, they are a producer, but they're also pulling energy from the grid, so they're consumer, prosumer. So there's tons of grants out there supporting those types of movements. Next. Some of the things that make this great is it's a trustless system, which means that there does not need to be a CEO like me. These organizations, which are called REDAOs, can be run by anyone, any group of people. With no central person in charge. So this is it's an innovation in energy trading mechanisms. It improves energy security, independence, resilience to centralized system failures. So basically, if the system around a virtual power plant in the community was online and everything around it failed, they would still be online. And this empowers small-scale producers and consumers. Next. You said 5 to 10 minutes, right? Okay, we can just skip.
You still got another 5 or so minutes.
Okay, we can.
No problem.
Some of these things we've already discussed, so.
Just to keep it in context, we will be talking about in some detail the way the current energy markets work. Which they're governed by, we talked a little bit about it, public utility commissions at the state level in the United States, as well as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the U.S. Department of Energy, the North American Energy Reliability Corporation.
FERC.
The idea that these are going to be decentralized is something that those groups, because they've been around for decades, are very entrenched with the utilities. You might even argue that the public utility commissions have been captured by the big utilities. So they can't even imagine that. So I think it's an interesting point in history where we have, on one hand, these technology-based decentralized solutions, at the same time as the power really still resides with the existing status quo.
But I will note before we move on that I had a lot of interesting conversations with the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, or FERC as they're known. And we wanted to know if it would be kind of a conflict of interest if we operated our virtual power plant. And the answer was no, it's not. On a small scale, virtual power plants can operate as long as they don't interfere with large scale grids. So, for instance, like a city of Chicago would have to go through FERC in order to operate. But small neighborhoods, not a problem. Okay, next. We talked about smart contracts. We can zoom through that. Next, peer-to-peer energy trading, talked about that. Regulatory, you just mentioned barely. You mentioned the basics of it, but I'll leave it to you to talk about more.
Yeah, that's going to be.
Yeah.
We're going to go into more detail in the future.
Yeah.
Lecture.
Yeah. Operational, we can skip that. We talked about machine learning and IoT. Skip that. Skip that. Microgrids. Okay. I like the heart. So microgrids, is anyone familiar with how they work? A microgrid is basically a small-scale energy system. So for instance, if a neighborhood generated their own source of power, they would be considered a microgrid. And that energy would be contained within that area. That's what it defines. But microgrids can also feed into virtual power plants, which could represent larger cities like Chicago or literally entire countries. So they form larger leaves on that tree that we spoke of before. Next.
They have no external support.
They can, so there's multiple forms. There's grid tie, and then there's off-grid, there's hybrid. It just depends on the configuration. Yep. And actually, this picture in the background, this is in Menifee, California. It's one of the first microgrids that was actually designed that way. So it wasn't just people got together and decided with a homeowners association that they should put solar panels up. It was literally designed to be a microgrid, which is awesome. Okay, next. So this is a diagram of how microgrids feed into statewide virtual power plants or anything larger than that. Make sense? Okay. Next. Next. Human rights issues. This is huge. So in Congo and parts of India and other developing nations, you do have child workers. You have all sorts of human rights violations that occur so we can live in the lap of luxury. There's all sorts of issues pertaining to the mining of cobalt and lithium and coltan and other semiconductors. And this is something that we have to be aware of as a global community. I mean, I understand that we're at a place where we still have to build upon a broken system in order to make something better, but ultimately, this is who's keeping the lights on for us, like right now. These are the people who are powering your cell phones, and to a more extent, building your cell phones. Okay, next. Okay, grid networks. We can go on. So as I mentioned before, regional transmission operators breaks down in the United States into 10 groups. Here in Illinois, right here, we're part of the MISO territory, which represents 15 different states, which is the largest out of the union. As I said before, Texas is its own system, so they don't tie into any other grid, but I think that's going to be changing soon. Okay, next. Okay, so homogeneity in virtual power plant systems, this is really important. So it's really important to understand the needs, the needs and the energy resources of a given territory before you just start building stuff. For instance, in places like Washington State, it's rainy there all year round for the most part. So how could there possibly be a solar system? It can't be. So that X's out solar entirely. But fortunately, they have lots of large bodies of water. So hydro and other forms of water, water to electricity generation can occur. Also, grid infrastructure and capacity. Like these things need to be analyzed to see if it's even possible to create a virtual power plant. The policy and regulatory landscape, cultural and social acceptance is a huge deal. I can't speak for other countries, but I will say there was a funny story in South Carolina. Did you know that a group of people down there did not want a solar farm in their area because they thought that it was going to absorb all of the energy from the sun? This is, I kid you not. They literally, so they fought tooth and nail to make sure that a solar farm did not come to South Carolina. I'm forgetting the name of the city, but that actually did happen. So we have to be cognizant of cultural and social acceptance. Okay, we can move on.
I just add one more
Sure.
thing? when the smart grid was rolling out many years ago in Illinois, there was a percentage, I can't remember the number, but it was a surprising percentage of people thought that the utility would be able to see inside their home.
Yeah.
From the smart grid.
Yeah.
So, you know, consumer education and especially in this world now of deepfakes and conspiracy theories is going to be, that's going to be critical to pay attention to for the energy transition.
Exactly. Yeah. But that's why there's people like us who can talk sense into the silly people. Next. Topographic considerations are important. I chose the tip of South Africa because they have very high elevation points and very low elevation points. There's places that are incredibly rural. There's places that are incredibly hot, which means that solar panels could potentially overheat, and yes, they can overheat. So when you're creating a topography for a virtual power plant, you must also look at the region, like, you know, see how it would respond to better understand and gauge what types of implementations can be built. Next. We talked about most of the challenges and securities, but cybersecurity threats are always going to be on the horizon. Let's see what else. But the good thing is it's optimized for market participation, meaning that the system teaches itself because we're constantly feeding it data. Next. All right, the future. So Mark and I are currently working on a vertical farm that will generate a modest amount of electricity through an initiative that we talked about very briefly called MFC, or microbial fuel cell technology, but that feeds into Project Kandor, which is a solar punk themed smart campus, so to speak. So we hope that in the near future, we will, as a society, begin to reintegrate into nature and to address some of the, I guess, discrepancies that we have, such as climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth, to live in harmony and to create a sense of synchronicity with the planet again. So that's coming next. And then lastly, I think, and this may be my own nerdy opinion, but I think the entire purpose of creating a sustainable energy economy is not necessarily just to be able to work your electronics, but to move toward what's called a Type 1 civilization. Type 1, or the entire scale, was created by a Russian astrophysicist by the name of Kardashev, which goes from, I think, Type 1 through 5, based upon the amount of energy that is needed to do various things. And in this case, Type 1 simply means that we have learned how to harness every type of energy in the planet and around the planet. So being able to control volcanoes would be an extreme version of that. And then moving on to Type 2 civilizations that has learned to harness all of the energy from our sun. Yes, and so on until you start getting into multiverse Marvel comic stuff. Okay, next slide. So in a nutshell, these are all of the core tenets that make up a virtual power plant, which in theory should relate to 24/7 grid reliability, making all of our lives much happier, healthier, and more abundant. Next.
That's the end of
David's
presentation.
Yes.
Why don't you join me in giving a minute? Thank you very much.
Thank you.